Kiara koto katoa, welcome to day 2 of our ICA Regional Hub here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Today's conversations, the way we have scheduled the panels, will focus on the concept of inequality and really look at ways of organizing as the strategies for disrupting and dismantling the inequalities we live amidst. The first panel for today is Community and Collective Action, NGOs and Beyond. So we will hear from the chair of the panel, and then we will go to 3 of our colleagues who are in different parts of the world. And then the final presentation of the paper with Professor Shiv Ganesh and Christine Ellers, I will do that from here. Okay, and then we can open up the space to questions for our audience here, as well as our audience that are watching online. So this is Professor Tim Kuhn, and we are going to listen to him first.
Hi, I'm Tim Kuhn. I am the chair of the ICA OrgCom division at the moment, and I'm welcoming you to this panel, which is entitled Community and Collective Action, NGOs and Beyond. I was the program planner for the OrgCom division this year, and I had the pleasure of taking a look at all these papers. And I think that these are some excellent papers that hang together nicely as a group. And we are fortunate for this panel to have Kirsty McCallum from the University of Montreal giving the response. So I'm looking forward to that as well. And so look in the comment area of the online forum here for how to access her response or discussion. I also want to mention the background here. We were supposed to be, I'm a professor at the University of Colorado, and we were supposed to be in Denver, just down the street from the University of Colorado, for this this conference this year. And obviously not doing that. The pandemic has interrupted that. We will be back in Denver in 2025, so a few years from now. But in trying to present a little bit of Colorado to you virtually, I wanted to display the town of South Park from the television show of the same name, South Park. The 2 creators of the TV show South Park both went to the University of Colorado, and South Park is an actual town in Colorado. Anyway, just trying to capture a little bit of what Colorado would have had to offer had we been able to be together. The 4 papers for this panel, and I have the real pleasure of introducing them, are first, Innocence Lost, Community Building as Praxis by Shiv Ganesh of the University of Texas at Austin, Mohan Dutta from Massey University in New Zealand, and Christine Ellers, also from Massey. Second is Coming Together in Tough Times, the Co-Evolution of NGOs, COVID-19 Issue Discourse and Organizational Community Networks. This is by Yiki Lee of University of Southern California, USC, Aimee Yang, also of USC, Jun Shin of University of Florida, Jingyi Sun of USC, Hyemin Kim from USC, and Yan Kyu of University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Third is NGO Roles for Corporate Social Responsibility, Network Analysis of NGO, GO, Corporate Collaborative and Adversarial Relationships in South Korea by Yuri Yang of UCSB, University of California, Santa Barbara. And then finally, The Paradox Between Voice and Engagement, Marginalized Refugee Voices in Collective Action Organizations by Min Kyung Kim and Melanie Questel, also both of Rutgers. As you take a look at all 4 of these presentations, recognize that creating that conference feel is the responsibility of all of us to insert questions, comments, suggestions, ideas in this online forum to try to recreate the intellectual exchange we would have in an in-person conference. I hope we can be in person next year in Paris, even better than Colorado, I think. But in the meantime, please take a look at these 4 excellent papers and Kirsten McCallum's response. Thanks.
The first paper, Organizational Sense-Making in Tough Times, the Ecology of NGOs, COVID-19 Issue Discourse Communities on Social Media.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for spending the time to listen to this video. We are very excited to share our recent research with you all. The title of our paper has been updated just as the rest of the paper. We have updated the most recent version of the paper to the portal. Hopefully you can see it. So now the title is called Organizational Sense-Making in Tough Times, the Ecology of NGOs COVID-19 Issue Discourse Communities on Social Media. I'm the leading author, E.T. Lee, and my co-authors are Aimee Yang, Jian Shin, Jingyi Sun, Haimin Kim, and Yan Chu. Before getting to the study design, I want to share a little bit of the motivation of the study. Why do we focus on NGO communities? Why do we focus on their communication on Twitter? And what kind of communication that we're focusing on? So the definition of a social issue is a problem or point of concern in that it challenges a social standard. COVID-19 is a very important and prominent issue that needs addressed, and it speaks to the definition of issue because it has affected many aspects of our lives, such as health, social aspect, and economic aspect. And issues are socially constructed. Issue stakeholders, their discourse, their network can really form around a certain issue, and that can help define the nature of the issue, and the stakeholders can coordinate different kind of resources and propose various solutions to it. NGOs play a very important role in social issue response. They have devoted their dedication, expertise, and community access to a lot of aspects of the social issue that are often irreplaceable. So yeah, just to add, that's why we focused on NGO communities on centered around social COVID-19 issue. And the reason why we focus our study on social media is because we have noticed the unique affordance of social media, in that social media can really support the formation of topic-driven communities. So by topic-driven communities, we mean that specifically to organizations, they can initiate relationship with others who share similar topic interests. And communication on social media is actually very multimodal, meaning that communication on social media has semi-public nature that combines into organizational communication as well as mass communication, which organizations communicate with the general public, that serves as more of a representational nature. So recognizing all those social media affordances for NGOs, we really want to shift attention to a theory called issue niche theory that can really help us understand their NGOs issue discourse communities, how that's formed around a present issue. So this theory is proposed by Dr. Aimee Yang in her recent paper published in Communication Theory, and we want to short that for INT from now on, just to for convenience. So INT is an extension actually of the organizational ecology theory, and it defines social issues as niches, and niches, which I refer to a collection of resources can support populations of organizations or their networks. And issue niche is actually defined as an issue space that channels public attention and provides a space for communication of identities and communication of identities and ideologies. So organizational community can really form around the issue space and build networks around it. Now I want to introduce some selective hypothesis and research questions. Because of the limitation of time that I have, I can only share some of the hypothesis and research questions. If you're interested, either go to our full paper or send us a message, and we're happy to share more of that about of this paper with you guys. So to start with, the definition of niche, as I just said, is a collection of resources. So for resources, there can be issue width, meaning the amount of the resources. So issue width is here defined as the amount of public attention that issue receives. So INT argues that issue go through life cycles when public attention really waxes and wanes, and for COVID-19, as we noticed that initially it didn't receive much attention, but then increasingly has received more attention as it goes on, and now it has become a global pandemic. Everybody's talking about it. So to start with, we want to replicate a proposition from the theory itself. We want to ask whether when the issue width increases, meaning the amount of public attention increases, we want to see whether the network sizes increase in both the whole COVID-19 issue and sub-issue niches. Theoretically, as we see a wider issue width, it's usually able to support a larger network size of NGO communities. And then afterwards, we propose want to study the different roles of generalist and specialist NGOs. So for generalist NGOs, they are the ones with a wide issue focus, and contrary to that, NGOs with very narrow focus, very specialized focus are identified as specialist NGOs. So as you can see, the first hypothesis here is saying that at the low public attention stage, generalist NGOs are actually significantly more active than specialist NGOs. The reason is that generalist NGOs have abundant resources, longer tenure, and stronger reputation. So they're more likely to act as an authority or leader, and they're going to cheerlead a certain issue when it hasn't got much public attention, and they really want to promote the salience of the issue in the public agenda. And we also propose that for the overall COVID-19 issue and different major sub-issue niches, specialist NGO will become more active than generalist NGOs at the high attention stage. So the reason is that specialist NGO in comparison, they have more specialized focus, and they have more specialized expertise and knowledge about how to solve specific issues. When issue attention is high, that's when their functions start to arise. And most importantly, we also want to add an extension to the theoretical framework by studying the co-evolution of network structures and discourse. This hasn't been covered in the theory, and we propose that this theory can be extended to study that aspect. So we ask, as the COVID-19 issue evolves from low attention to high attention stage, how are the changes in issue networks and discourse patterns related to each other? We have identified about 2,500 active NGOs, both grassroots and leading ones. And we used Twitter search API and extracted the most recent tweets of those organizations, which covers the first 5 months of the pandemic. We use keyword search to identify COVID-related discussion, and then constructed them into organizational networks using their retweets and mentions. We identified the high and low attention stages based on the data itself, as well as main COVID-related events. So March 20th was identified as a cutoff points between the two attention stage. As you can see on the right hand, both whole issue, health issue, and both the whole issue and sub-issue area, including health and economic issues, start to increase drastically around the March 20th. And then it's also when most states start to issue stay-home order that had really shifted our all walks of our lives. So that's how we made the decision. We have also identified a list of independent variables and control variables. We use a lot of human coding, and intercoding reliability was checked. And analytical procedures include both topic modeling, which identified the discourse of the NGOs COVID-related discussion, and as well as Oregon model, which identified the structural configuration of their networks. And all analyses were conducted on first the whole issue network, as well as the top two prominent sub-issue networks, which we identified that are health and economic issues. This is how the whole network looked like when attention was low and when the attention was high. And here also the visualization of sub-issue areas. On the left-hand side, the column on the left hand, it was describing when issue attention was low, and the right-hand column describes the visualization of the high attention stage of the network. And 6 topics were identified in topic models, including health, economic, policy advocacy, human rights, announcing funding, and information. In the bracket parentheses, and you can see those are the number of tweets. So each one was supported in all the networks. So it means as issue receives more attention, network sizes that it can support also increases. And for the overall COVID-19 issue and major sub-issue area, we didn't find evidence that generalist NGOs were more active than specialist NGOs at the low attention stage. But we did find that in sub-issue networks, specialist NGOs were significantly more active than generalist NGOs when attention was high. We also identified some co-evolution of discourse and network patterns. For example, when attention was high, mental health, humanitarian advocacy became a very prominent issue, which can be associated with the significant activities of humanitarian, health, and advocacy NGOs. So we have the result can suggest, and to some extent, that NGOs participate can really shift the discourse patterns. Here are some takeaways of our study. So we have identified that social media really could support topic-driven communities, and topic-driven communities can really take shape in the process of discourse. So while the evolving discourse drives networks, the prominent actors and their relationship may also in turn influence the prominent discussion. So it's kind of a feedback loop between the network itself as well as the discussion. And we have proposed that INT can really help explain type formation patterns in topic-driven organizational communities. So although we didn't find evidence that generalists were more significant than specialists when attention was low, we did find that specialists had more advantages than generalists in sub-issue areas, as they became significantly more active when attention became high. So the reason why we probably didn't find the pattern of generalists being more active when attention was low might be due to the fact that COVID-19 is still a very novel issue, and generalist NGO, they have not established their roles yet in this very novel issue, so we couldn't really identify any patterns. It will be very interesting to keep looking into the patterns of the NGOs as the COVID-19 pandemic, the issue has evolves in a longer period of time, and see whether that changes and whether generalist NGOs start to establish a more significant role, especially when issue attention becomes decreases eventually. Thank you all so much for spending time to listen to our study. We welcome any questions or suggestions. So if you have any feedback, please contact me at etv@usc.edu. I'm looking forward to hear from some of you. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Iki. Let's move on to the second presentation, which is NGO roles for corporate social responsibility, network analysis of NGO, geo, corporate, collaborative, and adversarial relationships in South Korea, with Yuri Yang.
Hi, my name is Yuri Yang, and I am a PhD candidate in the Department of Communication at the University of California, Santa Barbara. It's a great pleasure to be presenting my work to you on NGO roles for corporate social responsibility, network analysis of NGO, geo, and corporate collaborative and adversarial relationships in South Korea. In this study, the study is a part of my dissertation. In this study, I explore NGO, geo, corporate networks in South Korea to further understand how NGOs create pressures on corporations to improve CSR practices at the global level, and how national level institutional arrangements play into these network dynamics and CSR performances. Now, corporate social responsibility has become a critical concern in contemporary society, and CSR is not something that could be fully practiced by corporations only, but corporations need to engage and form networks with different sectors and agencies due to increasing complexity of social issues in the context of globalization and digital age. Many studies have suggested that among these organizational agencies, NGOs play critical roles in creating pressures on corporations to enhance social responsibility. As you can see, as NGOs develop their roles for CSR, they come into contact with various organizational agencies across sectors to form a large network that pushes for CSR. And my goal of this study is to further understand the network approaches that NGOs take in relation to CSR. My study is grounded in institutional theory, which scholars of organizational communication and CSR have long used to understand how organizations develop CSR. Institutional theory states that institutions are the formal and informal roles. They set particular social system, and organizations embedded within these institutions adopt these norms to develop their legitimacy. And CSR practices are engendered and shaped within this process. And I take network perspective to further understand this process. Network studies suggest that organizations adopt and converge upon a similar set of CSR practices through contagion mechanisms like cohesion and structural equivalence. My study seeks to further develop this institutional theory from network perspectives by first helping to understand how institutional pressures for CSR are created in non-Western economic systems. And second, my study will uncover more diverse network mechanisms that predict both convergence and divergence in corporate practices of CSR beyond the contagion mechanisms. And third, my study seeks to enrich the construct of institutional field that is conducive to driving CSR practices by bringing in NGOs into the picture. My study looks at South Korean case, which is a state-led market economy. This has been relatively less explored in the literature of CSR from institutional lens. What's unique about South Korean case is that in a state-led market economy like Korea, organizations, including companies and NGOs, are strongly influenced by governmental institutions and state interventions. And this is different from CSR in the US, where companies develop CSR practices more voluntarily without governmental interventions. And my question is, in this kind of economic system where government interventions are relatively high compared to the rest of the world, how do NGOs develop their networks in relation to governmental institutions to form networks with corporations and drive CSR practices? My first research question, therefore, asks, how does NGO-GEO network predict the NGO's networks with corporations? My second research question is, how does within sector NGO-NGO network predict the NGO's networks with GEOs and corporations? And I use 3 network measures to address these questions. First, I used to look at degree centrality, which represents embeddedness of NGOs and the number of their ties with other NGOs. And I also use the measures that represent positions. First is the item vector centrality, which measures their positions of influence or the NGO's connections to influential others. And between this centrality, which represents their brokerage positions and resourcefulness. My first set of hypotheses will address the first question by stating that NGOs' embeddedness and positions in NGO-GEO network will positively predict NGOs' embeddedness and positions in NGO corporate network. And the second set of my hypotheses will address the second question by predicting that NGOs' embeddedness and positions within their NGO-NGO network will positively predict embeddedness and positions in their GEO and corporate networks. For the study, I conducted network analysis. I collected network information from archival data, and these were the annual reports produced by 86 NGOs from 3 major civil society forums in South Korea, and the CSR reports produced by 52 South Korean corporations found on Global 2000, all produced in the past 5 years. And from these reports, the research assistants and I identified the organizational node names and their ties, as well as the nature of their relationships. And I found the 3 network centrality measures of NGOs and their cross-sector and within-sector networks and computed their relationships to address my hypotheses. In my first results, what stood out the most to me was that eigenvector centrality, or their influential positions within their networks with governmental organizations, emerged as the most important predictor of NGO embeddedness and positions within their networks with corporations. And this was true for both collaborative and adversarial networks. In other words, in order for NGOs to become actively engaged in collaborating with corporations, it's important that NGOs have collaborative connections with influential GEOs. As also, when engaging in adversarial relationships with corporations, it's again important for NGOs to first target influential GEOs in their activism. And I will use a small portion of my network data to illustrate what these mean. Here I have a sample network of an environmental NGO called Green Fund, in collaborative network with GEOs and another collaborative network with corporations. And if you look at them, Green Fund's structural position within their NGO-GEO network on the left looks pretty similar to how it's positioned in a collaborative NGO corporate network. However, when it came to the effects of their within-sector NGO network, degree centrality emerged as the strongest predictor of NGO embeddedness in positions within NGO geo and NGO corporate networks. And unlike the prior results, their influential position within their own NGO sector negatively predicted their embeddedness and positions within both NGO geo and NGO corporate networks, especially when their relationships were adversarial in nature. So this means that internally, it's most important for NGOs to focus on increasing the number of their ties with diverse NGOs than becoming or seeking to connect with an influential NGO in developing their networks with GEOs and corporations. And again, Green Fund's network within their own sector illustrates this. As you can see, Green Fund is also very central within its own sector, with the largest number of ties. As you can see, it's connected to other environmental NGOs and also to some other human rights organizations, some of which you might be familiar with, such as Save the Children and Global Vision. And then you can see that it's positioned similarly strong within its geo and corporate network. So these few key findings that I told you about have important implications. First, it informs how important it is to explore different national economic systems and institutional arrangements to further understand the variations in organizational practices that shape CSR practices across the globe. In the case of South Korea, where the state has a lot of say in what different sectors do, NGOs had to develop strong positions within their networks with GEOs in order to enhance their positions within their networks with corporations. And even when they were developing their intra-networks within their own sector, they had to think about how their internal network might influence their geo networks. And my study also reveals that network mechanisms of institutionalization of CSR are not limited to contagion and cohesion mechanisms. In fact, different types of centrality measures representing organizations' embeddedness and positions could be important indicators of how CSR practices are institutionalized. And third, NGOs play significant roles in a national institutional field in shaping CSR practices and creating pressures for CSR. Most literature on CSR have focused on corporate perspectives and business case CSR, but NGO perspectives should increasingly be integrated to further understand how CSR is shaped and developed globally. Thank you. Feel free to email me any questions or comment on any of my presentations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's move on to the third presentation, which is the paradox between voice and engagement, marginalized refugee voices in collective action organizations. This is by Min Young Kim and Melanie Questel, Rutgers University.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining our presentation. We are Min Kim and Melanie Questel from Rutgers University, and we'll be presenting our work on how refugees are depicted within the collective action space. Political upheavals, wars, and ethnic conflicts have led to waves of refugee migration for several decades. Refugees are socially and culturally marginalized populations in the social and physical domains of the community. As translocated populations in unfamiliar environments, humanitarian organizations are critical resources for them. The continuing migration of refugees led to the creation of cross-sector humanitarian organizations from government bodies to local and international NGOs and NPOs. The humanitarian organizations participate as collective action organizations and work under advocacy-oriented mission, responding to unjust social issues. Collective action organizations, also known as CAOs, are often comprised of advocacy organizations such as the humanitarian organizations working toward a collective mission. A constellation of research, however, argues that refugee voices are marginalized and silenced in media and within organizational context. Existing research underscores that many problematic depictions of refugees originate from the media, particularly in the Western media, and collective action organizations rather than the refugees themselves. While refugees are considered important social actors in the community, they're always marginalized from the main discourse, depicted as subjects of concern, needing assistance, often vilified, stereotyped, and viewed as hapless, passive victims. Arguably, these individual level issues get perpetuated by the media and organizations in the communities where refugees have settled to. Contrary to the media and organizational domain, the social media allows refugees to be their own storyteller and engaged member of the virtual community. What we witness about refugees in social media space is engagement, as they are the master narrator evoking empowered voices. This led us to think about engagement of refugees within the collective action organization's domain. Engagement is a process that requires both sides to be present and committed to being open to change. We argue that CAOs and their spaces are certainly created and exist for the refugees, but are not engaging them properly. To accomplish engagement, organizations must step away from the traditional perspectives that sees stakeholders as groups to be managed in order to meet organizational aims, and instead treat groups like refugees as equal participants. However, under complex stakeholder relationships and control, this is very difficult, especially within the organization's virtual space where communication for and about refugees are publicly shared based on bureaucracy and institutional values. We wonder how the voices of refugees are portrayed or represented. Therefore, we ask, how are refugees portrayed in organizations' bureaucratized and institutionalized virtual space? To explore how CAOs use their virtual spaces for refugees, we conducted a qualitative content analysis of 19 cross-sector humanitarian refugee organizations in the United States and their websites. We focus on the organizations in the US because despite soaring number of refugee admission to the United States since the 1980s, most refugee research has heavily centered around the EU context. We first conducted a general surveying of the organizations to have a better sense of the overall landscape of the websites, and then we employed Thor Bjornsgood and Big and Shaw's work on migrants' voice in the news media for refugee voice, and Johnston's definition of engagement to operationalize our key variables, which are refugee voice and engagement within the CAO space. Our findings show three main patterns. First, refugee voices are co-opted to serve organizational agendas rather than presented as collective action partners. Secondly, the refugee voices are used to endorse organizational goals, regardless of whether their stories are told in the first person or third person perspective. And third, the refugee voices are produced to project loyalty to the United States. While these key findings may be a result of strategic control of messages for stakeholders from the CAO's perspective, particularly funders and donors, it reifies the organizational agenda, excluding refugees as a meaningful partner, which leads to our another line of finding, which relates to engagement. We found that refugees are often unengaged in organizational endeavors and activities. First, only a very small number of organizations engaged refugees and their voices in their organizing and programming. Secondly, refugees are often neglected in key decision-making roles, such as holding leadership positions or to be part of the board members. And these findings confirm the lack of refugee involvement in a structural aspect of the CAOs, which reflect a facet of systematic marginalization as cultural and social patterns that are mediated through dominant culture. Our findings also demonstrate that refugee voices are present in restricted and unengaged ways, suggesting a number of organizational, cultural, and communicative concerns. Our study extends the ongoing argument about marginalization and lack of voice among refugees in their new communities. Results will raise two key discussions. How first, the refugee voices are represented in a paradoxical way. Although it seems like they are being included and heard because their stories are present within the virtual domain of the CAOs, the involvement is still mediated through organizational messaging and occurs for organizational gain. Here, we're not arguing that refugee voices are completely marginalized or silenced, but that their voices are still mediated by and for organizational needs that lose authentic agency and empowerment. This, however, paradoxically recenters the focus to the CAOs, not to the refugees in their virtual narrative. Therefore, the refugees become objects of collective action instead of an active participant in their own resettlements. Despite well-intended missions of the CAOs, refugee voices are co-opted for them and experience another level of exclusion and disempowerment. What CAOs view as positive demonstrations of refugee representations reveal how refugee voice is revised and compromised, which became the hegemonic norm of organizations. The CAOs in the United States exert hegemonic control of refugee voices, portraying themselves as benevolent organizers of refugee well-being. In return, the refugees are not fully engaged in organizational framing within the collective action space and have little power to change how their lives are described online. Such hegemonic norms of CAOs are results of clash between organizational advocacy principles and external pressures in relation to stakeholders, especially funders and donors. What we witness within the CAOs online space show the complicated dilemma of CAOs that they face between advocacy and systematic and structural irony. To support organizational endeavor, refugees become the vessel for the CAOs to continue their collective action work, which has been compromised to meet the organizational needs rather than the refugees. While the CAOs are expected to advocate for challenging the status quo of social injustice, their unengaged representation of refugee voices become trade-off for organizations. By focusing on a virtual organizational space where narratives are controlled and communicated by and through CAOs, we seek to advance how such collective action space, particularly within the organizational level, needs to change to engage refugee voice in a meaningful way. The concept of engagement suggests a promising leap forward for CAOs to consider in terms of integrating refugee voice in a meaningful and less organizational-centric way. CAOs can recognize such limitations and include refugees in admin or leadership roles, engaging them in key decision-making processes. We recognize the importance of the work that CAOs do and the need to promote their missions. CAOs face a dilemma in their presentation of refugee experiences, and they must make refugee experiences more sympathetic so that the larger community could see the work that they're doing for them. Yet the mediation of refugee voice has inadvertently created stereotypes of who refugees are and who they should be, which ultimately marginalizes them. Engaged organizing for refugees can challenge the status quo and reconfigure their voice so that they're no longer just the social minorities that need help. Such step will help CAOs to challenge the hegemonic norms of organizational bureaucracy and combat the unintended paradox of refugee voices. So moving forward, organizational engagement agenda will be critical to re-invite refugees as active narrators of their story and to empower refugee agency. CAOs do meaningful work, and embracing refugee voices through engagement will strengthen the mission and social causes they contribute to. That wraps our quick presentation. Thank you for joining us today. And if you have any questions, please contact the corresponding author, and we'd be more than happy to further discuss this with you. Thank you.
Thank you for that excellent presentation. A lot of great questions really to ponder on from that. I will now move to the presentation of our paper with Shiv and Christine. So we'll talk about culture-centered processes of organizing as ways of building voice infrastructures at the margins of the margins. I don't think you can see the PowerPoint screen, so I will need to change that quickly. So in this particular paper, we grapple with the question of what does it mean to organize, to build voice infrastructures at the margins of the margins, with the notion that the ownership of these voice infrastructures are held in the hands of communities at the margins of the margins. I want to begin by acknowledging the networks of researchers and community advocates that make this work possible. I sort of offer this image to argue that central to the work of building voice infrastructures are ongoing interpenetrating relationships between community organizers, community advocates, community researchers, academic teams, and media production and communication practitioner teams. I will outline the Tikanga of the culture-centered approach, then talk about the elements of culture-centered organizing, and really turn to the notion of the ways in which community ownership of democracy actually attends to the need for structural transformation as the basis for addressing the inequalities that actually constitute the marginalizing processes. So in the culture-centered approach, it is the building of the voice infrastructure that lies at the heart of addressing social problems that marginalized communities experience. And this, very briefly, this plays out amidst the interplays of the culture, structure, and agency, understanding that the social problems are embedded in the structural formations that underlie marginalization, be it in the form of colonization and racist policies, be it in the form of neoliberal policies, be it in the form of gendered policies, but it is really fundamentally the organizing of structures that constitutes marginalization. And in that sense, therefore, the transformation of these social problems actually calls for the dismantling of these structures, the ways in which we can take down these structures, because that's what underlies the formations that lead to the kinds of challenges we experience. Now, these structures then are embedded in relationship with cultures, the ways in which the communities make sense of the structures, the ways in which they make meaning of the structures, and the ways in which then they negotiate the structures through these meanings, which brings us to the concept of agency, which is, in a nutshell, the capacity of communities at the margins of the margins to transform these structures, to question these structures, and to actually offer frameworks for dismantling the oppressive systems that constitute marginalization. So the heart of the expression of agency is voice, and the culture-centered approach argues that these voice infrastructures need to be owned by communities at the margins of the margins. So if we go back to this earlier presentation that we saw then, when we asked the question of refugee representation, to the extent, the CCA would argue that to the extent that NGOs own that landscape of representation, to the extent that NGOs, whether in terms of engagement or whether in terms of putting up particular voices of refugees on their websites, to the extent that the NGOs own and control that process, the marginalization is going to continue. So we cannot really transform these oppressive, unequal structures until we engage in the politics of moving these voice infrastructures into the hands of communities at the margins of the margins. So this process of building voice infrastructures then draws upon methodologically three core concepts of dialogue, humility, and democracy. Dialogue as a way of dismantling the power inequalities, noting that these power inequalities underlie the ways in which dialogue is hegemonically constructed, that hegemonic formations of dialogue retain power in the hands of state and corporate actors, so that the terms of dialogue are defined by those in power. Similarly, the concept of humility then turns to this notion: how do we interrupt these inequalities in dialogic spaces by building in an ethic of listening to the voices of the other, by building in habits of listening to the voices of other, which then leads to this concept of radical democracy, meaning that for culture-centered organizing processes, it is the ownership of democracy and democratic participation at the grassroots in the hands of those at the margins of the margins that forms the basis of transforming unequal structures. So I want to sort of take this within the context of prevention and then use a case study with the violence prevention work that the Center for Culture-Centered Approach to Research and Evaluation has been doing to demonstrate the ways in which the hegemonic approach to prevention actually works to perpetuate these oppressive practices that constitute violence. So in that approach to understanding prevention and violence, we argue that it is the erasure of voice of communities at the margins, at the raced, gendered, classed, colonized margins that constitute the sites of violence. And we therefore see violence at the interplays of processes of colonization, patriarchy, and whiteness, all of which work together to create these sites of erasure. Within this context, and this is the argument that we make in this work, is that non-governmental organizations, and this is an argument that has been made by activists like Naomi Klein and Arundhati Roy, who point to the corporatization and privatization of NGOs. So the NGO sector as an instrument of capital, and be it NGOs that are made to look like they are owned by BIPOC communities, or be it NGOs immersed in structures of whiteness, or be it NGOs that are framed as indigenous owned NGOs, they reify these structures of hegemony by being located in the interplays of the state and in the market. And in that sense, therefore, the very perpetuation of the logics of the NGOs works through the erasure of voice. And in that process, even as NGOs might use the language of challenging whiteness or decolonization or addressing patriarchy, they fundamentally are in the business of profiteering through cooptation of voice on one hand and through the erasure of voice on the other. So the culture-centered approach really then asks, what does it mean to build or to co-create voice infrastructures at the margins? So the margins, and the starting point for that work then is to recognize that the organizing work cannot be, and this is, I think, powerfully reflected in the earlier presentation that we just saw, cannot be mediatized through NGOs. Yeah, because NGOs are in the business of profiteering from cooptation and marketing of that voice. So really the question is, and this is a difficult question, and particularly in a setting like Aotearoa, where the 1980s onward Rogernomics has been accompanied by the flourishing of the NGO culture, where this entire service space is taken over by NGOs that operate under principles of kindness and care, and we argue in our work simultaneously that work to erase spaces of community voice and community ownership. So how then do we build spaces of community voice? This really is the question of method as praxis for culture-centered organizing. So we see method as the basis of organizing at the margins. So I'm just giving you a brief snapshot of the various tools that culture-centered processes use, ranging from ethnography, participant observations, interviews, to photo voice, image making, digital storytelling tools. But at the heart of all those processes is the ownership of those tools by advisory groups of community members from the margins of the margins, who decide on the process of creating those tools, and therefore through that process create frameworks for their own organizing through the generation of knowledge held in their hands. This then becomes the basis for engaging. You'll see on the left-hand side of the screen, key stakeholder meetings, which is really the NGO sector and the government sector and the private sector. So in this context, it is the advisory groups from the margins of the margins who hold the power in terms of the conversations with the key stakeholders. So a critical process in culture-centered organizing is sort of the disruption of the mediation through NGOs. So you do not start a culture-centered process of organizing by going to an NGO or by going to an organization, even again, and I want to reiterate this, a BIPOC organization that might to you look like it is the representative of the community, and then say how we engage. And this is precisely how the state and the government practices its forms of engagement, which is, when the state has a variety of tools of engagement. And if you look at the neoliberal state is continually in the business of engaging. It's we have an engagement industry that has been formulated in order to do the engaging work of the state. And in fact, what you would find if you look at reports and audits of state actors is that they will farm out that engagement to often the private knowledge corporations. So you would see a PricewaterhouseCoopers or a McKinsey coming in and doing the engaging work for a ministry. So say if it is the police wanting to engage with BIPOC communities, they will hire one of these firms, then they will bring in key sector stakeholders that will facilitate the conversation, and then they will have an engagement report. So in culture-centered organizing, we argue that these forms of engagement are precisely the sites of co-optation, erasure, and more fundamentally of perpetuation of violence. So the question of turning power into the hands of communities then is also about interrogating the entrenched power structures of NGOs, the market, and the state. So that process is built upon within the context of subaltern organizing and building these voice infrastructures that are owned by subaltern communities, then is guided by three philosophical questions. And we have tried to convert those questions into very practical questions for organizing, asking who is not present in this room, that addresses this question of erasure, that also looks at organizing in that sense as a continual open-ended process, to ask which voices are not reflected here, and then to ask how do we build a dialogic framework of organizing that brings these voices in, so that the space of radical transformation of structures is rendered open through these ongoing opening up of infrastructures to voices of communities at the margins. I won't go through the method of this particular case study, but it outlines all of the things that we talked about earlier. But I want to sort of leave you with some key findings from this work and some of the articulations that voices articulate within the context of preventing sexual violence and family violence. The first thing they point out is that there is a fundamental difference between engagement and radical democracy. Engagement is when those with power hold the terms of engagement. So if it's a Ministry of Health doing an engagement program with indigenous communities on how do we engage, how to distribute COVID-19 vaccine, the power still is held by a colonial structure of whiteness, which is the Ministry of Health, mediatized through its NGOs that it recognizes. So a key point here in the politics of engagement is to recognize it is a ministry that determines whom it is going to have at the table. Okay, and therein lies the game of power, because this process of selection is fundamental to creation of these inequalities. While the concept of radical democracy argues we take that power away from ministries or from states or from government agencies or sector NGOs that hegemonically construct that space, but rather it is about local and indigenous communities at the margins of the margins who determine, okay, we have a need for a COVID-19 vaccine. How is the vaccine going to be distributed? Whom is the vaccine going to be distributed to? What are the messages that are going to be created around the vaccine? What are the other kinds of things that we need to do as we are giving the vaccine? What are the kinds of structural issues that we need to address? So you see, prevention moves from this idea of creating communication materials that are culturally sensitive and targeted to cultural communities, to actually the communities determining what that prevention, and in this context, vaccine distribution looks like within the context of the community. So a culture-centered prevention framework then, and I offer you this model to look at as what emerges from community voices, is places, if you look at the center of that model, it places community advisory groups at the heart of the process. Yeah. So these are groups of community members at the margins of the margins. And it's critical then that we attend to their organizing based on the principles of the margins and not mediatized through existing NGOs and organizations in the community. And those community advisory groups then determine their relationships with the sector stakeholders. And as you can see in this framework, the training or the listening, the learning actually has to happen at the sector level. So this framework actually inverts this whole process of engagement and whole conversation on its head, because it says that if you really want to address marginalization, what we need to do is we need to teach the state, teach the ministries, teach the government, teach the NGOs on how to learn to listen. Can you imagine when that emerges from within communities, how the state or the sectors respond? The amount of resistance to that, the amount of pushback to that is not surprising, but it is also reflective of the ways in which power has been consolidated in our societies in terms of how the organizing work has been done in neoliberal societies in terms of engaging problems of oppression and marginalization, which is that marginalization itself has become a business. So for the NGO sector, or for hegemonic organizations that build into these logics, they profit from marginalization. And this is heard best in the voice of a community member who says that, when we think about preventing violence in our community, we do not want the money to go into the professional salary of staff of NGOs who will actually be using the money to pay for their salaries, but rather the money needs to come into the community for the community to do its work of prevention. That also gets at the heart then of the political economy of this organizing logic, because in culture-centered organizing, in that sense, what it is saying is that the process of radical democracy is about turning economic and political power in the hands of communities. So the question that I will leave you with then, with this framework, is that perhaps, culture-centered organizing suggests the importance of addressing not only how communities can own voices and voice infrastructures, but also about how we dismantle hegemonic structures, how we dismantle the NGO sector that has grown to profit from this. How do we dismantle a state that has grown to profit from this and use voices to actually project particular images? Many community members in our work talk, for instance, about the narrative of kindness and how kindness is used as this anchoring narrative, while that doesn't really play out in their own lives. So it is that process of dismantling that is fundamental to turning power back into the hands of communities. Okay, I will stop there. And that brings us to the end of the 4 presentations and open up the floor to questions.
I just wanted to say thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting and how to say, critical right now when we when we hear from the media about how different marginalized communities across the world do not sort of buy into the government strategies of vaccination, and how medical researchers cannot come in from the sort of government level, and probably also like hegemonic NGO level, cannot understand the sort of resentment of those indigenous or ethnic minority communities to sort of follow the instructions of the government. And here, clearly there is that sort of possibility to apply culture-centered model and go into the community and allow the community leaders educate and sort of disseminate the message and sort of come from the bottom up rather than from up down in terms of vaccinations and all other medical information.
Thanks, Elena. I think, thank you for that. I think vaccine hesitancy is a really good example of this. And even that language of hesitancy, right, that is used by a dominant ideology, that is not really coming from communities at the grassroots. But, one of the things also we see continually in our work is this idea that even when we build in engagement, and that is where I would say the dominant ideology when engaging with culture lies at this point. So now we are starting to see projects that will say Ministry of Health funding initiatives to engage with Maori, Pacifica, migrant refugee communities, right? So there is that recognition that there needs to be engagement. And I think, as you're pointing out, and we are seeing this in our work, is that engagement still, and the terms of that engagement is held by elite academics and elite NGOs who go in and who think that I spend a week in a community, listen to Francine Mabu band, Breeze, and then I have a vaccine strategy I've created. So it's also the superficial nature of it, and also how those NGOs then go about selecting who their leaders are. So one of the things we are finding is that in a lot of cases in communities, you have leaders that are identified by the structure because they are palatable to the structure. And then you have leaders from within the communities that are actually doing the work on the ground. And, I give this example in one of our papers while interviewing a Maori grassroots leader who was running the EV checkpoints in the North Island. He was saying, the checkpoints were running really well up until the point that NGOs started coming in and money started coming in. And that brought in the conflict and started disrupting that process of organizing. I find that to be really powerful because that really also gets in the question of what are our roles. And in many ways, I think this is hard for ministries to hear, because what this work is saying is that what you actually need are for NGOs and academics to get out of the way and for communities to do their organizing work,
Can I pick up a point there? The idea of communities organising is fantastic, and they need resourcing. So what are some of the ways in which the institutions or the official lines organising can do things to support those resourcing those organisations, or that organising, that self-organising, without taking it over? Yeah,
so and that's why the starting point of that, Mary, has to be the ethic of listening.
Yes.
And for that here's the thing, and for that listening to happen, we need an entire deconstruction of the civil society, of bureaucracy, and of NGOs, because it seems that, and this is a global phenomenon, but it certainly also plays out in Aotearoa, is that it seems that there is a lot of consolidation of power that has happened on habits of posturing. So organizations that posture themselves as delivering certain things. But really that posturing has led to their profiteering and growing their structures. So at the heart, they're not interested in listening really, even though they might perform or give the performance of listening, you know. I'll give you a great example of this this work of building community infrastructures. So we have these community researchers who often inhabit very marginalized identities themselves, you know. So one way of disrupting that process is that we bring these community researchers into conversations with the government and with the NGOs. So we had one such setting. There are all these NGO actors and the ministry sitting around the table, and we have a community researcher on the screen. And the community researcher is saying, look, if you're going to give 25,000 to run prevention work, that first of all, that is more than enough for us to do our work. But it is more than enough only if it comes back to the community. And then he looks at the people around the table and he says, we don't want this money to go to you guys. Okay. But can you imagine how then that is shut down? So in fact, one of the NGO actors points to that person and says that, oh, that nice person, sitting there can say they can do it in the community, but really communities can't do it. And then turns to the ministry person and says, I'm going to send you my feedback on email, shutting that person off. And that person then goes offline. And then I have to, our team has to spend work with the community, assuring that these conversations can be safe. Because communities have such experiences of mistrust that once they have come to the space and the same thing has happened, again, it is that the same pattern is enacted,
Yeah. Reminds me of Stan Dietz's discursive closure that happens in any institution, but at this level, it's really political, hugely political.
Yes,
yeah.
Thank you. So then I guess maybe the question is that if we truly want to make change, and we are writing a report for the ministry on prevention work, but that process of change, then is the need for dismantling the structures and recognizing that creates uncomfortable spaces.
Yes, it's unsettling.
Right? It's unsettling.
Unsettles the settlers.
Yeah. But it also then, I think it goes back to something we were talking about in the workshop, is that it makes, it places your own body or the body of the work under the line because of the various kinds of pushback, right? And which might mean that the state might not fund you again. These are the kinds of things we were discussing earlier, right? Or those NGO sectors might not collaborate with you again,
So what's the role of the internal subversive? Someone who's on the inside. And is it possible to not be colonized by the system, but to work within a system like an institution, like a hospital or a medical institution or a university? Is it possible to be subversive from within?
And I think it is. And when we see examples of I want to say that when we do these interviews, we see examples of this, but when it is that ethic of listening. At the heart of it, it is people that have somehow been able to sustain their ethic and their habits of listening and recognizing that they need to listen to the margins of the margins. I mean, and it's really interesting how evidence gets thrown around. So in this meeting, as that person is saying this, we have NGO stakeholders that are then using the language of evidence, right? And there are academics around the table that are throwing in evidence to say that we have no evidence that communities can actually do this. And I'm like, really? So because what we actually have is that the only way this works is when communities run this. Top-down prevention interventions have effect sizes of 1% to 3%, and those effect sizes disappear after that intervention is gone. This is the crux of it. But here we have academics or NGOs that are using that language of evidence, to discredit this person from the community. So it's also interesting in terms of the politics of knowledge, how it is organized to erase, you know?
Well, just a few points. I mean, when it comes to being subversive, it's also a matter of people can be subversive in different ways. I think we are assuming here they're much more subversive. I think, I don't mean this in a negative way, for more on for cultural or more for other types of issues along those lines. But people can be subversive when it comes to, say, on financial kinds of issues, and not even be thinking about any kind of cultural kinds of issues or racial or ethnic kinds of issues, things like that. Much more along the lines of, I see this with, you know, academic board kinds of matters or university issues, where there are a lot of people I know who are more financially subversive or procedurally subversive because they see that as their way to put their stamp on things or their way to get things done. They're not thinking at all about issues of power in those senses, but there is a power dynamic, but for them it's much more the economic and or the financial or the procedural or the academic freedom aspect might come in, but not as much about issues of culture, race, or those matters for some people. It's not all about that. Like, that's generally how if I'm going to be subversive, it's much more along those lines, generally economic, when I'm in those types of forums at the university. That's all, or even procedural.
So can you give an example?
Well, like when it comes to if there's a new policy, I have to be careful so I'm not breaking any kind of, everybody knows I'm massive. But even when I was in the US, is we would have something at the faculty senate. Like here, our academic boards are not faculty senates. They serve at the leisure of the council. And they can be completely, all the universities, they can be completely, the vice chancellors serve on the boards. So the provosts, and the US, they're not the same way. They're different because their votes actually are binding. Here, they're not binding. And so one way to be subversive is to actually, when they're rewriting terms of references or other things, is to actually say, I know it's non-binding, but I do disagree with that. And so it's nothing about, it is academic culture, but it's a different kind of culture to still take that stand, even though it means nothing in the long run, because it's still going to get done. The councils are still going to say, yeah, we're rewriting your terms of reference because we want to, and it's done. So they still will do kind of things that they wish to do no matter what. Or even financially, if there's a new budget model coming out and you're like, yeah, nah, this is why I don't like that. One thing you can do is just, instead of voting on something, ask for continuance and continue delaying until, oops, we can't do it the next semester or the next year because we haven't met the deadline. And so the systems can't do things. So there's ways to do that, which is almost like the US Congress. You just keep delaying things if you know how to work things. And the same thing when it comes to, like, you know, we have here, I think other universities kind of might be the same way. There are programs where if they fall below a certain Fs, you know, a certain number of students, they can get closed. Well, that didn't pass unanimously throughout all the different programs. There were some colleges that were like, yes. Our other colleges were like, no. Our academic freedom statement, NBS stood up and said no to that. We knew it would pass no matter what. But I think those are ways to do things. So it's a different type of culture in that way.
So practices of resistance within organizations.
Exactly. So there's different reasons why people do it. But besides that, another thing I wanted to point out was when it came to the paper on Twitter and NGOs.
Yes.
An interesting thing for me, maybe this is kind of throwing an animal into the lions, but is I wonder if, two things. I wonder if Twitter's become too mainstream, where Twitter's just kind of like almost useless now as a social media outlet to analyze. I'm not criticizing them, but if you talk to people of certain ages, they're like, it's like Facebook now is basically for old people. I use Facebook, so I'm an old person. But Twitter has also now become, so many people don't use Twitter really anymore. It's like TikTok, it's now Instagram, it's Snap, even those are probably gone in 5 minutes. And so I wonder if we're using Twitter as analyses in our research papers because it's easier. But I wonder if it's actually really getting at really how people on the ground, if it's really able to really capture true changing communication, because it's almost too static, I would say. It's almost like, let's just analyze MySpace, which is now gone. I mean, Twitter is still there. We're looking at Trump's Twitter feed, but it's also an 80-year-old man. Not 80, he's probably, well, he might be 80 by now. But I'm just wondering if maybe we need to really analyze the medium we're using. And also there's a lot of research, I'm not familiar with the term, but our colleague Erica Pearson, one of the things that she would say is we shouldn't even use the phrase social media. There's another thing, it's basically the channel. Because if you look into other media studies, they would say like the idea of social, because it's not social. Twitter really isn't, by definition, social. And And so that's something else I would say that's really not social. Facebook's a little more social because there's more chat and back and forth, and we can do
Conversation.
instant messaging. So it's not really, it's almost a one-way form of communication.
Yeah.
Really, you can do a little bit of back and forth, but not really much. So Twitter is a very different form. It's kind of TikTok. It's a very different form versus Facebook, where you can do messaging and things like that. So that doesn't surprise me that their results came out the way they did, because I would say Facebook or Twitter is becoming antiquated. And it goes back to what we talked about yesterday, where it's in the time of COVID. And I would think now people are communicating online in vastly different ways, where of course the theories they're using can't relate to what's happening because it's during in the time of COVID. So those are some things I'm just thinking we might need to relook at our conceptualization of what is social media, what social media are we using? Is social media even the right phrase to use? And I know it's really popular in our field, but I'd almost say we need to maybe move away from using that phrase itself, unless we really are using a social media tool. And I would say Twitter, from the way it's set up, isn't. But someone disagree with me, that's fine. They can.
I mean, it's a fascinating question, right? The question of how do we conceptualize the channels, the different kinds of channels, and then, you know, what does COVID mean for how we theorize with our existing concepts, hasn't it? I really enjoyed that paper on NGOs and voices of refugees. I thought it was really powerful. You know, did you all have any thoughts on that?
I wanted to say, yes, I really enjoyed, and I think the formulation of the focus on the refugee voices was excellent to illustrate how quite often refugees are being used to fulfill the goals of those humanitarian organizations that deal with them, because obviously the main objectives of those organizations are to seek funding, to use it to promote the refugees' needs. But that means that they are looking into their own agenda and choosing what they want to utilize from the refugees' experience that is more strategic for them to gain more funding, without actually looking what the holistic representation of the experience of refugees are. So yeah, I really, really liked the paper. I think it was excellent. Yeah.
It also brings up a real challenge when we think about this question of voice, right? What really is authentic voice? And then that connects to questions of representation and identity. Who is doing the representing work? For what purposes, right?
Mohan, I found that paper really provocative, and I've written in big letters, read this paper, because it put me into the zone of organising around elders, because that's my space as older people. That's why I did my PhD a million years ago in retirement villages, because it was about how they positioned elders in terms of the market. And now I'm thinking, what about the roles of these NGOs that like Age Concern, Grey Power, and there are others I can't think of right now. But what about the voices of other elders, the marginalized, what do you say, margins of the margins? Where do they, and I think about even, you know, my in-laws who live down the driveway from us, or used to, it's, you know, where are the voices of those people in those small rural communities, and what their needs are and how are they heard? So I've moved into a different space with this. I think it's really interesting. The things we've taken for granted, well, I've taken for granted, certainly opening up.
And then, you know, the question is, how then can these voice infrastructures be turned into the hands of those communities at the margins of the margins, so that your in-laws or an aging person living far south in a rural community, for instance, actually has a voice infrastructure through which their articulations can emerge. And then again, the question also is, how do you go back and forth between individual representation and collectivization?
Because I think about how Pākehā elder are often portrayed in particular ways as individualistic, as wealthy, as being able to do this and do that. But there are huge numbers of people, and it's increasing. 1 in 4 will be over 65 by 2040. So we've got these numbers of people that are presumed to be like this when they could be like that, and over there, and things we haven't even thought of. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow Mary's comment that what I liked in this paper that was presented, that what happens when those humanitarian organizations use specific parts of refugee voices, they actually contribute to recycling of stereotypes.
Yes.
So that's what's happening, that they create the stereotype that fits in with their own mission statement, with their own organizational goals. And that means that lots of people fall out of the stereotype and do not gain at all. So their voices become muted, right? So they are not represented by this particular organization. And that sort of happens all the time.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there is this tremendous undervaluing of refugees, which connects to those passive, helpless images, right? And I mean, we see this in our refugee interviews. We have refugees in this community who are doctors. But I mean, you think about racist New Zealand laws that do not recognize their professional backgrounds and that the years of experience that they bring to this space, right? So they can only be seen as people in need of help and in need of care and kindness, stripped of their agency.
If I may, it's not just New Zealand though. If I may, I mean, it's, I'll just say that, I mean, it's so many other European countries, most European countries are like that. I'd also like to say a lot of the countries where the refugees are coming from are the same way when it comes to their laws as well. So just to flip that back, I mean, it's the same way if I became a refugee and went to say, India, I wonder if some of my credentials would be recognized the same way. Possibly not. And so I think we have to flip that back sometimes, where I think sometimes, unfortunately, I'm not trying to be ugly here, but I think sometimes sometimes I think we need to look also at the not setting, but the countries where individuals are coming from as well, where a lot of the laws here that we see as racist, discriminatory, are also there as well.
Yeah, but I think
in a different way, maybe
this is kind of getting into the space of you're equalizing. Well, these are not really equal in a sense that the countries from which people are coming out as refugees are constituted within a global network of power and colonialism. So I'll give you an example. So if you think about the instance of Rohingya refugees, right? That is a setting of colonization that constitutes the backdrop of that exodus. So I don't think there can be an equivalence in that sense.
I see your point, but I'll disagree because I think I've had a student who's been in Japan. So we see there where the laws there, I mean, basically are also, I would say, discriminatory.
Absolutely.
Towards immigrants. And I have another student who has moved, I have another student who's moved to Kenya. Same thing, discriminatory. And so I think I think that any country we look at, we're going to find, I think maybe it's not racist to use, but discriminatory. We're going to find them to incomers, whether they be refugees, whether they be immigrants, there's going to always be those issues to the out group. And so I think that's the key point we need to look at.
Right.
But always going to be that.
Yes. But I think in this context, and that's a good example, it becomes racist because of the power and inequality of global power.
Agree 100%. But I think that we also need to not ignore I agree 100% when it is racist in this context. But I do think we also need to look back though at there are still policies which
absolutely.
On the other side case would be discriminatory. But I think unfortunately a lot of people don't want to recognize that. In the dialogue, their feeling is, well, our people are coming to this country, they're coming to a predominantly white country, and there's all this discrimination and racism. But if I were to go there, I would face racism, I would face discrimination. And so I think we sometimes need to turn the mirror.
Yeah.
And the terms will be different and the power dynamics are different, but there's still dynamics that need to be addressed, I think. And I think that's the key thing, which is difficult to digest sometimes for individuals, but I think we need to look at that. Like I've had, one of the students I worked with in the US, a lovely Caucasian woman, ended up going to work in Saudi. Imagine the issues that she faced in her family. And so I think those are the kind of issues we also need to think, try to deconstruct. So yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with what you're saying about it.
And I guess, at the broad level, I think your point is well noted, which is, and, I want to just add to yours, when I look at Rohingya refugees and the treatment of Rohingya, because, CARE's work with Rohingya refugees is across 6 countries. And when I look at the treatment of Rohingya refugees in India, and I write about it, that when there is large scale Islamophobia, New Zealand looks like a paragon of virtue in some ways. That nevertheless, though, should actually mobilize us to make this space better, and at the same time recognizing how do we transform those spaces in other parts of the world, which goes back to this question of how do we build from these very local organizing to building global, national and global platforms, right? Which is where, the question of the NGOs again becomes so important, because to the extent that NGOs have been reduced to delivering services, right? You look at a Red Cross, it is delivering services. It is not going to unsettle the power structures. It's going to work with, it's not going to say the kinds of things, Stephen, that need to be said, right? So, one of our community and their research, Rohingya community researchers in India, and Rati talked about this, has been incarcerated. And we are now worried that they have contracted COVID while in jail. And it's based upon draconian policies, which don't really make sense at all. But what we are finding is that there isn't really an NGO that is there that will speak up in that environment. So we are scrambling to find legal support and lawyers to work around that person to create that infrastructure. So then that's also the question, right? Where are we going to build that infrastructure when all we have done in these highly unequal spaces is just organized NGOs to deliver services and not say things that are going to be uncomfortable, right? I was looking at another example in New Zealand Parliament. Have you all seen that discussion with Xinjiang and China in New Zealand Parliament? That debate having opened up, and what that parliamentary conversation was saying is that even in New Zealand Parliament today, because of global political economy and logics of trade and business, we are scared to have particular conversations. So whether we should debate or not about the human rights of the Uyghur is something in New Zealand Parliament is being impacted by the influence of China. Right? I mean, think about the vast power inequalities that relates to that politics, right?
But it's even getting harder in the US. If you look to even in academia, if you look to certain states that are now banning the teaching of critical cultural theory.
Or critical race theory.
And even if you look at like Florida, where now it's like they're encouraging people, students, to tape record their teachers. And if they do anything that is like controversial or political, to turn them into like, the McCarthy, witch trials and things like this. And so it's getting even tougher to even have academics be that sounding board. But then the question is, devil's advocate, is it the job of the academic, though, to be political? Some would say no. Some would say that academics should be apolitical in the classroom. Others would say they should be. So, I mean, there's different points on that. And I mean,
I hope in the 21st century there isn't an academic that says.
Well, no, but what I mean by apolitical is that some would say it's not the job of the academic to mold someone into their own political belief. That to teach someone that being political is important, I would say is critical. But that I don't want my students to believe what I believe.
No.
That they can believe whatever they want, but that they believe something. But that the idea that has been turned is that many who don't like the idea of an intelligentsia, which we see throughout history, the first thing you go after are the academics and the people who can think, is that they're not doing that. They're actually making all these liberal socialist hippies are out there
They're
turning
doing
everyone else into pinko leftist liberals.
Like,
No, that's not what we're doing. A lot of my best students have been hardcore conservatives, and I'm fine with that. I wish they change, but I'm not going to make them change.
but Stephen, what you're getting at is that is the propaganda of power, and power does that propaganda because it is scared of these voices.
Of course.
And you see, this is how it's connected. How our community researcher got shut down is it's the same phenomenon, right? When voices speak, power is going to try to shut it down. The same reason why we can't talk about Xinjiang in New Zealand Parliament, right? It is because it is connected to global power and power configurations. Okay, it's 10:35. We are 5 minutes over, and I want to make sure that we have enough time before we head out into the next one. So thank you so much, all of you in our audience, and we will see you in 25 minutes.